Hey, everybody, welcome to today's show. It is our distinct pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Tucker. Amongst other things, he is founder and president of the Brownstone Institute, Senior Economic Columnist for Epoch Times, author of 10 books. Liberty or a Lockdown is one of the more recent. Thousands of articles caught my attention to sort of shook my attention, should we say, to talk to him about some of the things that went down that we've been learning about, talking to some of the players on this show. And particularly, we're going to look at Dr. Birx's book and some of the thoughts that she had. Jeffrey Tucker is here with us, as well as your calls, and you guys, of course, on Restream. Let me see if there's more I can tell you. Of course, Dr. Victory will be here with us as well, and we may even have time to take calls today, so we'll see what we can do. Let's get right to it.
Our laws, as it pertains to substances, are draconian and bizarre. The psychopaths start this way. He was an alcoholic because of social media and pornography, PTSD, love addiction, fentanyl and heroin. Ridiculous. I'm a doctor, for Christ's sake. Where the hell do you think I learned that? I'm just saying, you go to treatment before you kill people. I am a clinician. I observe things about these chemicals. Let's just deal with what's real. We used to get these calls on Loveline all the time. Educate adolescents and to prevent and to treat. If you have trouble you can't stop and you want to help stop it, I can help. I got a lot to say. I got a lot more to say.
And so here we go. Today, as I said, Jeffrey A. Tucker, founder and president of the Brownstone Institute and senior economics columnist for Epoch Times. Boy, there's a lot for us to talk about. So let's welcome Jeffrey Tucker into the program.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
It is our distinct privilege. So Dr. Victory and I were sort of on a thread with you before the cameras and the mics heated up here, and we were unloading. We couldn't wait to talk to you. We've had so much on our mind that what you've been commenting on is pertinent too. And I guess we ought to start with Dr. Birx's book and the sort of extraordinary lack of self-reflection as she marched through what she experienced during the pandemic. And let me just frame it by saying what we have learned by talking to many of the people that were in the rooms during the decision-making of those early months. She sort of marched off by herself and was an evangelist and went around demanding that governors follow her precepts. What did you learn from the book?
You say by herself. I think by that you mean without Trump's permission, without the Oval Office.
Without I don't think there was a coalition. There may have been her own little coalition, but what we've heard is that there were a lot of people left behind going, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. I don't know if little or big. It's not clear, but this much is true. She was gone rogue from the elected official at the United States at that time, on whose behalf she was working. It's still not clear. But so it went like this. Matthew Pottinger of the National Security Council introduced Trump to Birx and said she's the perfect person for this role as the coronavirus task force coordinator, right? And Trump said, okay, fine. Well, it came down time for the lockdowns. We're talking about like March, the first week of March. She was already training to be the one to announce to Trump that the lockdowns would have to come. And so she was very tight with Fauci. On March 12th, they talked him into these travel restrictions on Europe and Australia and New Zealand. On March 13th, he issued the HHS order that was basically the lockdown order. Came out later. New York Times was the first to publish it 2 months later. The weekend of the 14th and 15th was when Birx and Trump had their one-on-one, right? In the presence of the son-in-law, anyway, and Kushner, and also
Jared Kushner,
Jared Kushner and several other White House officials, and it was she who basically talked Trump into going into that March 16th press conference that basically ended the world, right? That was the Monday press conference in which Trump, whether he knew it or not, was issuing a statement that in the fine print that Birx herself refused to read publicly and rather turned it over to Fauci to read, which said all places where people gather should be closed, which would include, of course, not just bars and restaurants, but churches and even homes and so on. So it was probably the most draconian uh, issuance of an executive order in American history. In fact, hands down, that's what it was. At that press conference, she was reluctant to read it because a reporter actually raised his hand and said, "Are you saying that all these things should close?" And Trump said, "Well, we're not saying that yet." And at that moment, Fauci interrupts, motions to Birx, winks at her, says, "Now's the time." She gets up to the microphone, changes the subject. Fauci realizes she's not going to do the thing, which is to announce the lockdowns. That's what they're waiting for. Fauci then interrupts her. She gets like this nervous girl routine, says, "Well, he's my mentor. I have to let him talk." Fauci does the job. He gets up and says, "You need to read the fine print on page 2 of the PDF." The reporters are there, turn it over. They can't see it because it takes like a magnifying glass. That's where it says all places where people congregate should be closed, according to the CDC. Trump, meanwhile, is not paying attention. He's looking out at the audience. Somebody catches his attention, and he does his little jazzy hands thing, waves at them, like a politician does, gets back up to the microphone, rolls his eyes, and takes the next question. That was the end of the world. That was it. And it was Birx that was tasked with doing it. Now, soon after that, after the first 2 weeks to flatten the curve, she was trying to figure out how they're going to get an additional 2 weeks. In her book, she says it was always a ruse. It was never supposed to be 2 weeks. It was supposed to be much longer. That's all they thought they could get out of Trump. But in one occasion, after nearing the end of the 2-week period, Trump announces to and you remember this, Dr. Drew, Trump announces to the nation, we're going to open up everything by Easter. Remember that?
I do remember
so
that.
if you look at the dating of it, that was long past the 2 weeks. Birx took that information and said, aha, he's open. He's open to an extension.
Mm.
So the American people heard that as like, oh, maybe we can go to church finally. Forget the First Amendment. Maybe we can go to church. And they saw that as a heroic action. Trump wants to open up the economy again. Rethink this. What actually happened is that was past the 2 weeks, and that was a signal to Birx and Fauci, especially to Birx, that they had some latitude and that Trump is open to an extension. So that's when they went to him and said, "Listen, Mr. President, we've gained so much in these 2 weeks of lockdowns. This has just been great. We've been able to, manage the hospitals, get some more supplies in, get the ventilators to people who need them, and so on. We've been able to restrain the spread. If you open up now, it'll lead to disaster, and you'll be the fault of millions dead." So instead of asking for 2 weeks, which was what she was planning to do, she changed her mind and said, "Let's ask for 30 days." You see? That's how clever she was.
In that, and I remember in the book, she was also saying that, how do I coerce this dude? How do I present the data and ask for a decision from the elected official? It was, how do I coerce and manipulate to get this done? As though, again, thus saith the Lord, what dropped from her lips. And that's the part that I find deeply disturbing. And my recollection is what happened from there was Trump said open by Easter. That's when she went to the governors, and that's when my state locked down completely and never opened up again.
Right. It was during that 30-day window, right? So now she's flying around.
Yeah.
But finally, Trump got sick of her. After he gave her that second approval, he wouldn't speak to her again. She was very hurt by this. Went to Pence and said, "Trump's not speaking to me. What should I do? I don't know what to do." It was Pence that said, "Stick with the program. Stick with the program. You need to keep going. You need to keep going." So he gave her protection while Trump refused to meet with her anymore. And he stopped going to the coronavirus task force meetings entirely and stopped holding the press conferences. You remember after the bleach disaster? He stopped holding the press conferences. Well, she went full rogue with the backing of whom, I don't know. But she went from state to state to state to state, even going to Texas and persuading Texas of a mask mandate. And, that's when the SWAT teams were going in to arrest people for drinking beers in rural bars and so on. And so the only governor who absolutely refused to meet with her was Kristi Noem of South Dakota. So God bless her. Just banned her from the state completely. So, but otherwise it was she who prolonged the lockdowns. Well, she and the Congress had been voting trillions of dollars in subsidies and so on. But Dr. From that point on, I think it's the best way to think of it is that Trump was no longer president. He was a marionette at that point, and that Dr. Birx was, in fact, making all the decisions with Robert Cadlick and many other people having her back. A very strange time in American history. And then, of course, fast forwarding to the summer, we had the Black Lives Matter protests and that sort of thing, and then re-lockdown all the way to the election, and then the release of the vaccine following the election. So that's a short history.
Now,
but Birx was our dictator, and she was later caught, as you recall, having gone to see her family and gathered with her many homes in the Northeast and defying travel restrictions.
Now, it seemed to me that, let me think what I was going to bring up here. The state to state part of it was the sort of egregious part. That's where the sustained lockdowns were carried out. I guess what I was going to say was the one thing I've learned during this, as it pertains to Dr. Birx and this being the de facto ruler of the land or determining policy for the land, my understanding is the way our public health system is sort of set up in the eyes of the Constitution, there's room for that, which I had no idea. So it's not as though they were, in other words, we can argue about whether it really specifies that or not, but my understanding, or what I've come to surprisingly learn, is that public health officials in an emergency are given fiat authority.
They assumed it. It's not clear whether they're actually given it. The Public Health Service Act of 1944 allows for a quarantine power under certain circumstances, mostly having to do with importation of animals that are infected or plants or that sort of thing. It's rarely been invoked, but they took that and ran with it, especially the sanitation portion of that 1944 Public Health Service Act, and they used that as an excuse, to make us wear masks and that sort of thing. But for the most part, it was a strange combination because, as you know, lockdowns were never part of the pandemic plans, right? They never were,
No,
from the
right.
World Health Organization
Correct.
or the CDC or anyone else. But they had an unwarranted amount of discretionary power, and they just ran with it to do things that nobody ever thought possible. I mean, I knew it could happen. I never believed it would happen. But they used every latitude in the law. And of course, the courts couldn't meet because they were social distancing and shut down. So we couldn't actually, and they weren't functioning. Nothing was functioning. The Bill of Rights was effectively abolished for a very long time. And schools were shut down. It was outrageous. The hospitals were shut down. Parking lots were empty. And this is a very grim period. And this is also a period, too, in which you couldn't freely travel from state to state because there were quarantine orders on all sides of the borders. You remember this, right? I mean, like you had to quarantine 2 weeks before you could leave the state, and the dentistry was basically abolished for the better part of 6 weeks during that period.
And as
crazy
you say,
times,
crazy times, and never before contemplated in the history of medicine, save maybe some 11th century Venetian outbreak of plague, where things went completely backwards by invoking this sort of thing. It was 12th century. But the fact is that the email threads now that are available thanks to all the FOIA applications suggest that FOIA and Birx sent a team to China. That team was completely hoodwinked by the Chinese counterparts, and they brought that home, and that's what convinced Birx and Fauci to pursue this new, never before thought of technique that was strictly speaking a political maneuver by the CCP.
The junket to China from February, 14th to about 26th, maybe it's 15th to 26th, is one of the least understood aspects of this entire thing, where Fauci sent his deputy assistant together with a team from the World Health Organization to go on a sort of Potemkin village tour of China, where CCP showed them how well they did in controlling the virus. And the World Health Organization issued a report on February 26th to all nations of the world, saying China knows how to do with the coronavirus. Everybody should copy this exact approach, and everybody agreed. The Fauci's deputy assistant uh, agreed with that. All the emails agreed with that. They sent it out to the world. I asked a person who really know whether and to what extent the lockdowns would have ever happened without that report. And he said, there's no way. That was the thing that decided everything. And if you look at all the Fauci correspondence between about the 26th and the 29th, he changed his mind about lockdowns. You remember that New England Journal of Medicine article that he wrote came out February 28th, but he had written that 2 weeks earlier. That was the one that said this is going to be a bad flu year. Don't worry about it. It's not so bad. Do you remember that one?
Right.
He made a decimal
Yes.
point
Yes.
error, and he confused IFR and CFR in that paper. But nonetheless, it came out on the 28th. Well, it turns out he had already changed his mind about lockdowns by that time, because on February 26th, he wrote the 1980s sort of influencer actress named Morgan Fairchild. This, as far as I know, is the first time Fauci ever raised the prospect of lockdowns, wrote her a private email and said, alert your followers that lockdowns are coming. Do you remember that? And so Morgan
I
Fairchild.
don't remember that. I don't remember that.
Morgan
She was the
Fairchild.
very first American. Yeah, Morgan Fairchild. Am I saying that? Yeah, she's that Vava Voom actress from Dallas in the 80s or something like
Yes,
that. She
yes,
also
I
played-
remember.
They're from
she was in
Falcon
TV.
Crest, wasn't it?
Yeah, Falcon Crest. And she played Dottie on Pee-wee's Big Adventure and the latter. Anyway, the whole thing is just ridiculous.
Oh
But
my God,
anyway,
that's true.
and so Fauci knew her and said, well, alert your followers that lockdowns are coming. So that was on February 26th. On this 27th, Donald G. McNeil was on the podcast of the New York Times, which at those days went out to 2 or 3 million people, and whipped up disease panic. He came into the studio spraying hydrogen peroxide everywhere and saying that 1 in 6 of your friends is going to die, from this virus, which reminds him, he says, of the 1918 flu pandemic. It's going to be much worse. And that day, I knew that everything was going to go terrible. You mentioned the 11th century Venice, I think you said. Well, on the 28th of November of February 2020, Donald G. McNeil wrote an article for the New York Times op-ed page called "To Take on the Coronavirus, Go Medieval on It." So that's exactly what we did, right? He said, yeah. Anyway,
That's exactly what we
it was
did.
those were grim days. That same day, the New York Times ran an op-ed by, of all people, Peter Daszak of Eco Health Alliance, which we know now
Yep.
was the recipient of a pass-through grant to the Wuhan lab, from which many people think this virus emanated as a lab leak. So there you go.
Yeah.
And so from the 28th, that was the end. That was the end of the world. That was when Fauci decided lockdowns were the way to go. They had fully 2 weeks to convince Trump. Birx was tasked with doing the dirty work. And she did it, and she accomplished it. And then they were done with her, and her head is on a platter, and I don't know where she is now. But her book is a fascinating one. Sometimes I think I'm the first one to have read it, because
She went to work
it had
with
been out.
Biden, I thought.
For a while, but she's
No,
not
I
there
thought she
now.
was
Not
she
now.
moved over to his camp during the
Not now.
no.
She's
No,
working-
but she
no,
did after that.
Yeah, she was fired in November. Maybe she worked for Biden for a little while, or she resigned in November.
I mean, that's what I
after
read
being-
somewhere.
Yeah, being caught violating quarantine, that sort of thing. But now I think she works as a
Mhm.
consultant for some air ventilation company or something like that.
That's
But
right.
her book is
That's
right.
her book is a fascinating study. It's called Silent Spread, I think is the name of it, right? And it's all hinges on this idea that there was a long latency period to the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, which turns out not to be true. SARS-CoV-2 behaved very much like a textbook respiratory virus, a coronavirus. There are 4. This is the 5th one, has a relatively conventional latency period. But see, the thing is, Birx was speculating that had a long latency period as a way of kind of gaming the normal trade-off you would have between severity and prevalence, right? So, in other words, a way to get everybody whipped up in a state of fear. Now, what's interesting about this is, like, if you want to think about a virus that has a long latency period that's also lethal, what would you think of? Right? AIDS. HIV, right? And that is her entire history of infectious disease. entirely formed through that AIDS period, which had this unusually long latency period. So that was the whole model she brought to pandemic control for what turns out to be just quite a normal respiratory virus, right? So it was
Yeah,
it was
a
the
respiratory
long
virus that
model.
Yeah, that will do what it does regardless of lockdowns. It will just respiratory viruses just do what they do, and it's interesting to me, having been there responding to Dr. Fauci and his team during the HIV pandemic. He was a hero to me at the time, and they were. I'm looking back now. You've shined a light on something for me that's another liability of having been so, I think, successful during that epidemic, but they used some of the techniques that they were using with coronavirus, which was fear. Do you remember? It's equal opportunity. Everybody's going to get this thing. High school students, you got to wear a condom because you're going to get it. I was part of the chorus. I was there. We were consciously using fear. Now, it was fear without social media, without all the incredible numbers of outlets and the way things mob today. There was fear when you had 4 networks, and that's the only place you could sort of put your information, and maybe out on radio. And it was a very different technique than in today's media landscape, number one. Of course, the polarization just added another layer to that as well. So they were using fear, number one. Number two, the issue of the latency. They were very familiar with that and relied heavily on it. And again, the simplicity of the messaging and the repetition of these simplistic messages made sense when there were 3 networks, but now they just looks like distortion and lies, because people start to get their own information. They start to get multiple sources. They start to realize that they must not think I can handle the truth, which is indeed what was in their minds, I think, at the time.
Also, the idea of disease avoidance and suppression. That's another thing that they had in common. So if it's AIDS, you really don't want to get AIDS. And we didn't rely on herd immunity for AIDS, right?
No,
So
but
we
to
couldn't
your
rely
point,
on-
we never did public education about how to survive AIDS. Like, there was so many things they could have done to help people survive coronavirus, including something simple like your state has bought your government has bought monoclonal antibodies. They're available everywhere. Get it from your doctor. You know what that is? Ask your doctor. Nothing about improving the outcomes.
That's right.
Crazy.
Another factor that has in common with the AIDS experience was the eventual realization that prophylactics were the best way of avoiding infection. So that's what the mask was. MPIs were the prophylactics.
Right.
Yeah. So everything is an analogy there. Also, I'll mention something else: track and trace. Right. So track and trace was used with actually not a lot of success, but some plausibility, at least in the case of AIDS. So they transferred that over to the SARS-CoV thing, a common respiratory virus that everybody was going to get. They were going to use track and trace. Do you know that I was just in Mexico? To get back into the United States, I had to report my whereabouts for the track and trace regime. This was last week. This is still going on. Oh, so I go from Mexico City to Connecticut, and I come back with COVID. They're gonna track where and do what? I mean, we're still playing these games, and again, it's all from the AIDS experience.
And it was all so poorly executed. I had an alpha or a delta. I had a bad COVID early on, and when I was sick, I reported it, and the public health. I got a call from public health, and they went, anyone else exposed? I said, well, there's a few in my household. He goes, yeah, we'll let them know. Let those guys know that they're probably exposed anyway. So see you later. I mean, it was just like there was no formal tracking, nor testing, no nothing. Just say, let them know they're probably going to get it. Thanks. I was like, what? And it was, by the way, it was like a 19-year-old kid from the local public health department. It was the weirdest thing ever. I won't forget that as part of this either. But let me do something. Let me take a little break here.
And they do what? Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, do what? Exactly. And then he'll get the same.
Once you know. Right.
Well, he'll get the same call. He'll get the same call from the 19-year-old going, have you had any kind of contact with anybody? Yeah, maybe somebody at the grocery store. Well, all right, let them know. And all right, we're going to take a little break. We're going to do some business here, and we're going to bring Dr. Kelly Victory in to continue with Jeffrey A. Tucker. Again, it's brownstone.org. We can find Jeffrey's work and a lot of interesting stuff. His review of Dr. Birx's book is epic, and I suggest you read it. We'll be right back. Genucel has so many products that Susan and I love. Their XV moisturizer locks in moisture, making dry spots a thing of the past, which is especially great with the colder weather, of course. And with the immediate effects, too, you can see these results in as little as 12 hours. Guaranteed or your money back. Susan loves Genucel's Vitamin C Serum, the new deep correcting serum with lactic acid that hydrates your skin and reduces fine lines while preventing future wrinkles from forming. Don't believe me? Listen to Susan.
I am a snob when it comes to using products on my face. The dermatologist makes a ton of money from me. But when I was introduced to Genucel, I was so happy because it's so affordable and it works great. I was introduced to the Ultra Retinol Cream, which I love at night. All the eye creams are amazing. People notice my skin all the time, and I'm so excited because it's actually working.
Take advantage of this New Year's promotion by going to Genucel.com and getting 60% off now with a complimentary gift set when you subscribe to my favorite package at Genucel.com/Drew. All orders are upgraded to free shipping for the rest of the season. Use code DREW at checkout for an extra 10% off your entire order. That is Genucel.com/Drew, GENUCEL.com/DREW. My guest is Philip Patrick. He is a precious metal specialist, trains at University of Redlands. He has spent years as a wealth manager at Citigroup, and his current position is with Birch Gold Group. So gold has always been somewhat of a safe haven, particularly in times of great turmoil, much like our present moment, I imagine.
Gold has always traditionally been a safe haven asset. Gold specifically has always been about wealth preservation, right? Gold has always held its buying power. You can look at as far back as you like in history. In biblical times, 1 ounce of gold would buy somebody 400 loaves of bread. And today it does the same thing. So it's a store of value. But I would say in times like this, as you mentioned, it's particularly important when you're dealing with things like 40-year high inflation, the air that's coming out of a stock market bubble. These times in particular tend to drive gold and silver up quite significantly. If things are different, the solution needs to be different as well. So I encourage everyone to get informed, and we have a lot of good information here to help your listeners.
Just a reminder, I am not a financial advisor, and I do not give out financial advice nor investing advice. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, countless 5-star reviews, and thousands of satisfied customers. Check them out now. Visit birchgold.com/Drew and secure your future with gold. Do it now. Some platforms have banned the discussion of controversial topics. If this episode ends here, the rest of the show is available at drdrew.tv.
There's nothing in medicine that doesn't boil down to a risk-benefit calculation. It is the mandate of public health to consider the impact of any particular mitigation scheme on the entire population. This is uncharted territory, Drew.
Indeed, it has been. Yet we've been sort of charting our way through this uncharted territory for quite some time here. Dr. Victory, welcome back. With Jeffrey Tucker still with us. Susan had something to ask Caleb across the mic here before we proceed. I guess there's a technical issue,
answered.
Susan.
It's all working.
I don't see any comments from Facebook, but if you're out there, we want your comments.
Okay, fair enough. Kelly, have at.
Terrific. Thanks so much for joining us. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. And I know that you and Drew have covered quite a bit of it already, but I want to stick for a few more minutes, if you will, with this book by Deborah Birx and really her involvement in this whole debacle. And that's what it was. She is responsible for a lot of things, not the least of which is destroying my confidence in scarves for women. I have a very nice Hermes scarf collection that I just can't bear to don. And it's just laying fallow in my closet right now. And I can't bear to bring it out. In any event, I always thought prior to this book and frankly to this conversation with you, that she was somewhat of a talking head. I don't think that she actually made any decisions of her own. I thought she was sort of the mouthpiece that stood up and regurgitated whatever Anthony Fauci told her to say. Is that not sure? I get the idea that that's not really correct.
Well, I don't know. I think she got religion at some point. She was a radical suppressionist and a serious lockdowner. She really wanted to make sure that nobody would ever get COVID. And the only way she could think to do that was by enforcing lockdowns and masks and travel restrictions. There was no kind of draconian anything. That was enough as far as she was concerned. She thought she was on the side of the angels, and she just flew around the country and passionately went from governor to governor, from public health office to argue for this. And I'm not sure. I don't think it was Fauci so much that was giving her the marching orders. I think she was acting not on her own, but somehow she believed in what she was doing, and she brags about it in the book. You know, really critically,
Absolutely.
there's 2 or 3 moments in the book where she says, so you have to think back to those days. The initial idea was to reduce the number of cases, right? So flatten the curve, Matt.
Slow the cases.
More they
slow
can
them.
slow them, and all the way to zero if you could. I mean, that they convinced Trump that if
Mhm.
in 2 weeks he could
Right.
get rid of coronavirus entirely, right? So that minimizing strategy was always her way of thinking. And so everything she could
Mhm.
do to minimize the spread was just for her, just like a dogma, was something you would just do. But in order to inspire people of the need to lock down more, to mask more, to restrict more, to get rid of indoor gatherings and so on, and can't keep schools closed and everything else, she wanted to maximize the amount of fear, which came with
Right.
sort of exaggerating the danger of the virus to everybody, which in those days it was easy to do, because if you had PCR testing that was running at a very high cycle rate, you could generate what they called a case. Right. So
Sure.
we've had a huge confusion all over 2020 and 2021, and even now, between infections and cases, a long established distinction in infectious disease epidemiology
Right.
that we just threw out the window. So suddenly every PCR positive case was for her a danger, like this person's going to
Right.
die kind of thing. So so it was left to her to constantly keep everybody whipped up in a state of fear. So now you have the Trump administration of appointees, right? Trump himself and all of his closest advisors and all their appointees trying to claim that because of Trump's actions, things were getting better. You had Birx, on the other hand, trying to prolong the panic as long as possible. So
Mhm.
every week, and she discusses this in her book and brags about it. Every week on Monday morning, the coronavirus task force would distribute a report to all the public health officials in the country. And all the final data came in on Friday. She would wait till Sunday night, manipulate the data, change the data, rearrange the data, bury the news she didn't want people to hear, elevate the data that she did want them to hear, and send it out for approval Sunday night, where she knew everybody was at the bars drinking. She did this for several months straight, and she brags about it in the book. She openly manipulated and doctored those reports that went out to the states to create panic, so the states would continue to lock down. Everybody would still maintain their disease panic and frenzy. She brags about it several times in the book. She calls it like subterfuge, subversion, I think is her word.
Right.
And
Right.
she brags about it in the
Yes.
book. Amazing.
No, no, it is stunning. In reading the book, there's an element of hubris, where she really, with absolute, it just has no sort of concern for the fact that she did this, that she obfuscates the data, manipulates the data. And frankly, there's a word for it when you are supposedly working at the behest of the president of the United States and you go out of your way to mislead him. And she acknowledges that. As you said, she acknowledges that when it came to the lockdown, that she knew if they told President Trump anything more than 2 weeks, that and she even says this, because of his business acumen, he would understand what a critical impact that would have on the economy, and he would never go for it. So she essentially says, so we lied to him and told him 2 weeks when we knew that wasn't the case. It's really remarkable. And you may be correct that she is actually a zealot, because she doesn't seem to have any
Yeah.
concern
So
about that.
she was sure that lockdown was the way, and she had no exit strategy. None of these people did, actually. I mean, You know, I
Right.
remember in April, I remember I got a call from I don't know if you know a guy named Rajiv Venkalia, I think is his name. And he was
I don't.
Gates Foundation virus head. And his history traces back to the Bush administration, 2005, 2006. He's the one who claims to have invented pandemic planning in the form of lockdowns. He called me in April and told me to shut up. I need to stop writing against the lockdowns because I was one of, there weren't many of us really, but I was writing against the lockdown and trying to say this is a disaster. It's going to create all sorts of unemployment and despair. It's going to create a public health crisis. People are going to turn to substance abuse. It's going to be a disaster, and it's not going to get rid of the virus. Right? That's what I was saying. And he called me up and said, "You really need to stop writing this stuff." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to do that. However, let me ask you a question. What if the lockdowns work? Where does the virus go? Where does this virus go? I mean, does it just get scared of the politicians, scared of our social distancing, and go, well, I guess humanity didn't really like me. I better just go away now. I mean, what virus has ever done that of this sort? What
Well, but
virus of this sort has gone away?
they had a vaccine fantasy, the vaccine uber alles. So it went from safety uber alles to vaccine uber alles. And if the vaccine was going to rescue us, all we had to do was get there. You get there with as few fatalities as possible.
But I think the issue really
it was wrong. What's that, Kelly?
Well, I think
Dr. Drew,
Go ahead,
you know
Jeffrey.
something that I didn't know that at the time, right? I mean, we're talking about April, maybe it was May of 2020.
Yeah.
I had heard about this idea that they're going to come up with a vaccine, but I'm very old fashioned. I thought they would want to test it and that sort of thing.
How dare you?
But yeah, exactly. Yeah. Crazy. Don't be crazy.
I mean, but so I figured it was going to be like 5 years off at the very minimum. So when the guy told me on the phone, I said, "Where does the virus go?" He said, "Well, we're going to reduce the R naught." You're mixing up cause and effect, dude. You can't. You don't. I mean, let's say we all hide under our sofas and the R naught goes down and down. I mean, once we come out from under our sofas, the R naught's going to go up. I mean, what are you talking about? And he said, well, and it took a long time. He finally said, "Yeah, we're going to vaccinate our way out of this pandemic." And at that point, see, you're smarter than I. You're smarter than I am. You knew. I didn't. I nearly dropped the phone. I said, "You are going to vaccinate your way out of this pandemic? What are we going to stay locked down for 5 years? Are you out of your mind?" I couldn't believe it. He said, "No, I think it's going to be a lot sooner than that." Well, at that moment, I thought I had heard everything. I just couldn't believe it, that they really thought that we're going to stay locked down until we get a safe and effective vaccine.
But see, I think this is where the question really, in my mind, Jeffrey, is whether or not they actually believed that any of these things worked. For example, if you take masking, we've known this isn't something that we discovered during COVID. We've known for decades that masks do nothing appreciable to stop the spread of respiratory viruses. Social distancing is a made-up construct, doesn't exist in public health for controlling viruses. And there isn't anybody out there who could have passed Virology 101 without knowing, for example, that there isn't a long latency period for respiratory viruses. I don't think that Deborah Birx could have possibly, either that or she's the dumbest person in her medical school class, because
I think, no, guys, having lived through the opioid pandemic, when I saw how people deluded themselves about pain and opiates, that when I was being demanded to give opiates to my heroin addicts in withdrawal because they didn't have a happy face for their pain assessment, that was insane. And these people believed it, and they were evangelists. They were evangelical. Once scientists or physicians develop a religious orientation to their point of view, run, everybody. That's how untold harm gets done. Yeah. It's the evangelical that then gets a hold of the lay leaders, the public health, the governors, the press, and now it's on. And then those do the bidding of punishing any of the naysayers, any of the dissenting opinions. They don't have to, the public health doesn't have to do that anymore. The press, the academic institutions, the state societies will take care of it for them now. And that was the playbook for opioids, and that is the exact line and verse experience we had with COVID. It's just extraordinary to me.
I tell you what, I never would have believed what you just said, Dr. Drew. It's just remarkable to me that you can see this so clearly, because in the early stages of lockdowns, I didn't believe for a second that this was in the end really about the vaccine. I thought the vaccines were a fallback position to get us out of lockdowns. I never imagined the purpose of the lockdowns was to make the vaccine. I mean, that's just,
Correct.
you know, I mean, that's just like next level crazy. And certainly in the spring and summer of 2020, I never would have imagined such a thing. But you know what's fascinating to me about all of this, of course, is that in the end, the vaccine didn't perform as expected. So you know that leaves us in a very strange position, because, well, basically a complete loss of trust in a massive industry and in public health, generally speaking. So it seems to me something of a calamity. And we're also left with the carnage, right? I mean, and there's no reason for us to go through the carnage. I mean, 2 years of lost education from kids, it's substance abuse, a public health crisis, obesity through the roof, cancer screenings missed, cancer through the roof. You know, just a total public demoralization, a loss of respect in government, which Henry Kissinger predicted, by the way, in his Wall Street Journal article. I think it was like April 1st. He said, if this doesn't go well, the loss of trust in government will be worldwide, and it'll be and the world will be on fire. That's what he said. I don't know what to say. It did not go well. We're a different country now than we were 3 years ago. I mean, let's just face it. This is a calamity. And if what you're telling me, it was all about wanting to deploy some experimental technology in the form of vaccine,
Absolutely,
for what is for most people a very mild inconvenience. I mean, look, COVID was bad for me, but I'm of a certain age, right? But for most people, it wasn't anything like. It didn't warrant this kind of lockdowns, and that so all this was all just kind of an industrial experiment.
Well, let me put a different blush on it, because I was willing to. I believed that our system would improvise their way out of it and figure out therapeutics and or vaccines. I knew how our system works. I believe by the end of the summer, we'd have solutions. So to me, if people, I didn't think the lockdowns would work. I didn't think they were necessary, but I thought, I'm a good citizen. I'm going to follow what these leaders are doing. They're doing the best they can. They're planning for the worst case. I do believe there will be solutions. But the grave errors they made, now let's think about it. I hope I can tease this apart in a way that's sensible, was making it seem as though the risk was equal across all age groups. Okay. Now, the reality is the vaccines, we got to be able to hold two ideas in mind. The vaccines did help the older population. I'm convinced when the day is done, I could be wrong. Kelly thinks I'm wrong, but when the day is done, I believe we will have helped the people over the age of certainly over 75 with the vaccines, which was really the people at risk and the ones that we were alleging we were trying to save grandma. We were alleging that. But because we so overstated the risk to all the other population, the answer still had to be the vaccine for all ages. And now it has a risk-reward ratio that is completely upside down and completely different than for a 75-year-old. And now we get into real trouble. And they don't go back and say, you know what? We overstated the risk to all the 20 and 30-year-olds. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Sit by, everybody. You're going to be fine. Instead, they go, the risk is terrible. I can't stand to see another person on a ventilator. Vaccine for everybody.
That's right.
It was all about the
about
the vaccines, without a question. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
But if you go back to March 8th, Fauci's testimony before the House Subcommittee on I don't know, the virus or something, I don't forget now about them, but he was very interesting because he had every opportunity to explain exactly what you just said about the huge gradient of risk, 1,000-fold difference between the young and the old. Right? We knew for sure, based on the Diamond Princess case and all the data out of China, we knew for the better part of March 8th, we knew for the better part of a month, the truth about the gradient of risk gradient of this. Fauci had every opportunity to say that in that testimony. He did not. You remember this
we
testimony,
knew
right?
we knew yes, we knew the risk gradient of HIV early in that pandemic, and I don't think that has come from his mouth to this day. To this day,
They tried to do the
it
same.
was everybody's going to get it.
Thing with monkeypox. They tried to do the same thing with monkeypox.
Yeah, they were going down that path.
I mean,
they were going down that path.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, it's just criminal because in that testimony that day, because everybody's like scared, right? This was March 8th. We're already gone through January, China's lockdown. Now we got travel restrictions. And we got a whole month of February where Fauci and Farrar and the rest of these people are trying to figure out what they're going to do because they're afraid of the lab leak. Now comes March 8th. Already Austin, Texas has canceled South by Southwest by edict of the mayor. And so now the Congress is like, Mr. Fauci, can you tell us what's going on? They're all white with fear. And so he starts by saying, and he waits until the Q&A. So, right, his official prepared statement is a bunch of blather. You can just throw out the trash like the rest of these government officials. But during the Q&A, somebody says, gee, can you tell us, like, how risky do you think this is? Like how bad is this going to be? And Fauci begins by saying, well, the last coronavirus was SARS-CoV-1, and that was 2003. There were 8,000 people infected, and 775 of them are dead. So that's a 10% fatality rate. And then he leaves it silent. And everybody's like,
with no age gradient. So no age gradient.
Right. No. And then he goes on to say, now, the data out of China that we're seeing today, which every year says, well, they're lying, right? They've already got 10% in their head. It's like the data out of China that we're seeing now estimates at 3%. And so he's inviting all the Congress people gathered to think, oh, well, that's a lie. It's probably much worse because we know China lies. Then he goes on to say, well, but once you include asymptomatic infections plus people with minimal symptoms. Okay, so what are you talking about? Asymptomatic infections? Are you sick or are you not? I mean, so we know what he's talking about, but they don't know what he's talking about. He says it could bring it down to 1%. But if you think about the annual flu as having a mortality rate of something like 0.1%, that still makes SARS-CoV-2 10 times worse than the annual flu. So think about it that way. And he stops. At that moment, like every face in the room is white. Everybody was terrified. That was March 8th. So he was already grooming the entire U.S. Congress to get into this panic lockdown mode. And as you say, in that testimony, not one word about the age gradient, not one word about the risks to the elderly people. And we know what happened after that. Of course, they shoved COVID patients into the nursing homes, killing God knows how many people. But it was an outrageous.
It went over to the press then. Then it bled over to the press. Somebody came up to me. I was working in a newsroom at the time at a local television show, and one of the news directors came up to me and said, This is an extinction event, right? This is the extinction of humanity. I was like, you're a news person. Are you, what? Are you, I said, no such thing. Not even close. And that's what they had in their heads. So back to where we started this, Kelly, you were talking about whether Birx believed it. I think they believed it. I think there was cognitive dissonance running amok. I think they convinced themselves of this stuff and they were going to save the world. And that was it.
You're more generous than I, because I will tell you, it was clear to me from the very beginning. I mean, I said literally the second week of February, I said, this is insanity. This concept of wearing masks, social distancing, the talk about lockdowns, asymptomatic spread.
You did.
I said from the very beginning, February of 2020.
Yes, you did.
I said, this is absolute insanity, people. I said, you could not have passed Virology 101 and you don't have any background in public health because the risk-benefit calculation is off on all of this. I said, furthermore, it was the therapeutic nihilism on top of that. We aren't going to talk about the things we knew by the second week of February that vitamin D deficiency was strongly connected with a poor outcome. We knew that obesity, we knew that all of these things, yet we couldn't talk about any of that. And if it truly was about public health, they would have been at least at the same time, coincidentally, hammering home on those things, but they weren't.
You would
Instead,
think
it was,
you would think, like I said, monoclonal antibodies, all the things you can do for yourself. But Kelly, I want to sort of lead you as the witness for a second. And Jeffrey, apologies for the language I'm about to use. Kelly has something called the unfuck it bucket, and I want Kelly to focus on that for a minute. What can we do to unfuck it? Given we're all three of us are in agreement about what we're looking at here, save some nuances and stuff. But how do we unfuck it?
Yeah, just to give you a little bit more background on that, since you just got caught off guard, I was talking about that it's important to have bucket number one on the data and to continue to focus on the data as we know it with regard to these vaccines. Number two is my accountability bucket. And I do think that accountability, real accountability, is critical to ever healing and moving beyond this. And that's a discussion by itself for a whole day. And then my third bucket was how do we unfuck it bucket? Because we have got, there's no time for a victory lap, as much as I would like to do one, given how I was treated during this thing, and to run around and say, I told you so. There's not time for that. We have got to put every smart mind at how do we fix this? Because otherwise we are looking at a tsunami of illness, suffering, and premature death. So where do we go from here? How do we do that? It takes leadership.
I think it certainly does. And you know what it also takes? It takes a little bit of honesty and a little bit of humility.
A lot.
Like if we could start there, I would be so happy. If we could just, the people who were attacking me for 3 years now and we're urging, lockdowns and masks and vaccine mandates and school closures and everything that has just been such a disaster. And told choirs not to sing and
right.
all these. And if we could just get a little humility and honesty, just like all you have to do is maybe just send a tweet and go, I got carried away. And there were a lot of victims, and I was really wrong. And it turns out a lot of things I believed were not true. It turns out that if I'd done a little more research, even in the early days, I could have known about the age gradient of risk. I could have tailored my advice a little bit better. I could have had a little more compassion for my fellow human beings than I had. In fact, I really just fell prey to disease panic, and a lot of my advice was really wrong. And I'm sorry if I contributed to harming so many people and demoralizing so many people. And I'm sorry about what happened to the education of your kids. I'm sorry you couldn't attend your grandmother's funeral. And I bear some responsibility for that. This was a very tough time. As a public intellectual, as a doctor, as a medical professional, as a public health official, I had responsibilities. I completely failed. I forgot about the working classes. I didn't care about the people I was shoving in front of the viruses. I forgot there were people that had to keep society running while me and my friends hid under the sofa, and I recommended you do the same thing. I knew the masks didn't work. I recommended them anyway. That was humiliating for you, and I'm sorry. Like, just write something like that. If we could get all these people, and we're talking about quite a lot of people, to just admit that they were wrong.
Right.
That would begin the healing process. We need that as a country because we know that they were wrong. We know that
right. And unfortunately, physicians, I hate to tell you, Jeffrey, are leading the charge in having been wrong. My own colleagues have a lot of accounting to do. I have really said, I think everybody involved in this, from public health officials to politicians, people in big tech, people in the mainstream media, every governor needs to, and every physician needs to answer 3 questions. What did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? Because I'll tell you right now, people have got to answer to that. And as you said, there is no forgiveness without contrition. And at this point, we have had 0 contrition. And then the question really, so I think these are all go into my sort of accountability bucket. The issue about how do we rally the troops, given how divided we are now, to actually put people's minds to
How do we fix hundreds of millions of people took these shots? I can't even call them vaccines. Hundreds of millions of people are in the ongoing experiment, because that's what it is, of these mRNA injections. They aren't FDA approved. We don't have a lick of long-term data about them. And we are seeing, mounting evidence of severe adverse events. How do we find, number one, get them to pull these things from the market at a time when, Kathy Hochul's saying that, she still won't let healthcare workers back to work if they're unvaccinated. And the amount of ignorance is stunning. But how do we get them pulled? And how do we actually redeploy resources, every resource, medical resource, to say, how can we help all of these people who are facing potentially some pretty significant downstream, medical issues?
I hate to say it, but the damage is done. It's so sad to say that, but what's happened has happened, and it's terrible. It's terrible. Scott Adams said this the other day on Twitter. I don't know if you noticed, but he said, look, I like him because even though he mischaracterized our position, he said we were right because of a coin toss and said several other insulting things. Nonetheless, he was willing to be held to account for, and it's taken him several days, and actually each day he gets better at it. I don't know. Is there some sort of thing that goes in a person's mind once you realize you're wrong?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
No.
Cognitive dissonance was its type.
Well, no. He is up to something, and he is trying to get people a persuasion move where he brings people into realizing that you'll see. I see what he's doing. Well,
what
did he say?
I was glad he said that those of us who aren't vaccinated are the winners. But I was a little bit offended that, as you said, Jeffrey, he suggested that, he's very smart and he used his advanced analytics, and for some reason they led him astray, while I was just sort of a knee-jerk, distrustful of big government, and therefore I just chose right this time. That's what.
That's a persuasion move to get people. It's a persuasion move to make people realize that you were right. That's it. You were right. That's where we're going to end up after all the craziness stuff.
I hope you're correct about this, Dr. Drew. But, he did say something that I found terrified. He said he has to live with the rest of his life knowing he took these shots that he didn't really need, and he doesn't understand this experimental technology. And what is this going to mean for him in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? That's true. Is a terrifying thought. And I can just tell you, being on this end of Brownstone, by the way, I never wanted to get into this vaccine area. It's not my area. I have no training in it whatsoever. I don't like it. It's too controversial. I'd rather just focus on lockdowns and masks, right? But there's no avoiding it. So we got into and you follow Brownstone, you know what we got. So I've had to do this just because the adverse effects are just so overwhelming, and it's part of public health. So yes, I'm addressing it, but I get floods of emails every day. Like, how do I get unvaccinated? What can you give me? What treatment can you? It's like, that's not, I can't do this. This is not what I do, but it's tragic.
Yeah.
It's deeply tragic. I don't think we can undo this damage, but the question so I think we need the healing. We need the honesty, and we need the humility. Okay. That's step one. Let's get there. Then the question is, how do we prevent this from happening again? And I'm afraid at this point, it's not about getting some new president who's going to get the right appointees into HHS, CDC, and NIH. That is not going to work. They'll be chewed up alive, like on the spot in the first hour of their job. We cannot do that. We need dramatic reform. NIH needs to be devolved to six different regional areas or whatever, and they need to go back to doing what they're supposed to do, which is funding research that the vaccine company is not willing to pay for because there's no profit in it, right? So therapeutics and serious medical research. Let's get back to that's what public health is supposed to be about. CDC, I don't know what to say. I mean, is there any hope for it? I think it's been permanently discredited, right? So if we get somebody with a clear head in office and a clear-headed Congress, and this shouldn't be a political show, but I don't see any purpose for it whatsoever. Look, at what point are we just going to say, let's unplug this beast and start over again with good public health principles? I think that's essential. I also think we need to revisit fundamental things like the 1944 Public Health Services Act that gives the federal government the
Right.
quarantine powers. Now, I know, Dr. Drew, you've probably got a lot of good ideas on how to use a quarantine power under various conditions. If this happens, this happens, this happens. So the point is, this power has been massively abused.
Yes.
And under those conditions, I just think we just need to take it away. We just need to get rid of the quarantine power, like forever. They should not have this right. They've abused this privilege that they were granted under this weird 1944 Act, conditions of passage of which I do not understand. But let's just get rid of it. I mean, the government has abused this power. We've learned that individuals and their doctors and medical professionals working with actual patients based on their own knowledge and experience could do a much better job of mitigating diseases and pandemics and dealing with infectious disease than these centralized health officials, to say nothing of the national security officials that somehow got hold of the process this time. So let us learn to have truth, let's have honesty, let's have humility and the courage to admit error, and then reform the system in a way that's consistent with human rights, compassion, good science, and good therapeutics and good doctor-patient relationships. That's to me, that's a small program, but it's the essential program. If we can't do that, we're just toast.
No, I think it's critical. One of my greatest concerns, truly, as someone with a long background in public health, is what is going to happen the next time, because there will be a next thing. It may not be a next pandemic. It may not be a viral outbreak, but there will be something at which time we need people around the globe to heed our call to arms, whatever it is, and to pay attention. And at this point, the average person thinks, y'all are a bunch of rubes. I'm not paying attention to anything you say. You are 100% wrong. You led us all down a path of, suffering and destruction. And so I think we have undermined the public's trust and confidence, not only in vaccines, but in public health in general. And it's going to take a long time to regain that. So I think blowing up some institutions like the CDC is really going to be critical to regaining that trust, unfortunately. Another thing I do want to ask you about, just because I think you've got such great insights, there's some things that we have now become inculcated to our entire, society that I fear are never going away. For example, I've predicted, I don't think you are ever walking into your dentist's office or your doctor's office again without people wearing masks. I think that's become, I don't think you're going to ever get on an airplane when some flight attendant isn't going to hand you an alcohol swab. And I think that things that went away, some of the niceties,
I like that.
Some of the niceties, like cloth napkins, or actually having a ketchup bottle on the table as opposed to some nasty little, disposable paper thing. Our quality of life, I guess, is what
But
I'm
you
saying.
still can't get a lime in your vodka soda, Kelly. You still can't get a lime in your vodka soda.
And I'm not sure that's ever coming back. Some of the stuff.
What is this vodka soda issue? The lime? You mean on airplanes
in
or
a plane?
restaurants?
Yeah, because there's some
airplanes.
It spreads COVID, I guess. I have no idea.
That was something that they got rid of during COVID.
And that's what
it's a problem.
They use
I mean,
COVID as the excuse.
Right.
So
right.
in after the 1918 pandemic, which happened for a variety of reasons, no reason to talk about it here, but there were basically 10 years of disease panic that followed, right? Everybody got freaked out about germs. Everything is infectious. Everything is disaster. I'm surrounded by people who are trying to degrade my immune system, and degrade my health and kill me. And that prepared the way for basically for eugenics programs to become very popular in the United States. That was a fallout from the disease panic of 1918. God willing, we'll avoid that. I don't know. But, even as late as 1929, when we had the parrot flu scare, we were still freaked out. And then all sorts of governments up and down the East Coast ordered the slaughter of parrots in people's homes because they were afraid they were spreading disease. So these kind of disease panics are a disaster for civilization and for our social functioning and for our rationality and for good treatment of medicine. That is why the New York Times, a good public health, for a century following 1918, systematically avoided these kinds of public panics and these scaremongering tactics, because they know that people just lose their minds and they stay with lost minds for like a decade after. And that's why in 57, 58, the New York Times said, calm down. If you get sick, see your doctor. Otherwise, we're going to get good therapeutics and vaccines and it'll go away. Said the same thing in 68, 69. Don't cancel anything. If you get sick, stay home in bed. If it gets bad, go see your doctor. That's the way they handled pandemics in the old days. And H1N1 in 2009, people went to Obama and said, "Oh, here comes a terrible disease. We better lock down." And he said, "Look, guys, I just don't have any time for this. We're in the middle of a financial crisis. Go find somebody else to bother." Right? That was the
I loved
right
him.
thing to do.
Well, we have an entire
so,
generation of kids now. We've got an entire generation of young people who have an inherent fear of others you go to the grocery store and they're swabbing the handle of the grocery cart with, antiseptics and wearing, masks. And I travel every week, and it's the young families. It's the, people in their 20s and 30s with little toddlers wearing masks, and kids, mommy saying, stay away from those people. God help us as a society, really, because
That's right.
We don't know
second
yet.
In second and third grade, we used to play cooties on the playground, right? And every society has its version of that, right? Okay, but that's what you do when you're 8 and 9 years old. Okay, but it's presumably we graduate from that. We do things like read cell biology for dummies, and we take cell biology in ninth grade, or hopefully we pay attention. We didn't, apparently, but we have played a giant game of cooties throughout the whole of the world, with the exception of like 5 nations, and that's going to be stuck with us. And it's childish, it's dangerous, it's pathological, and it's contrary to the science that we earned and learned over 100 years. We've got to reverse this. We need some good education. Thank you for your show, by the way. But we need to have a much bigger audience. We've got a lot of damage to repair and get people back to an understanding that my mother had. My mother understood this. Her mother before her understood this. Her mother before her understood this. She knew that in April I was going to go see my mother in Texas, and I said, "Mom, I'm not sure I should come because I might give you COVID." She said, "Well, there's a couple things about that. One is, if you give me COVID and I die, that is the fault of the germ, not yours. I love you, son. Come see me." So God bless you, Mom.
That's sweet.
I love your mother. That's awesome.
Can I interject something that really pisses me off? Okay, I'm just going to say it.
Okay, this should be good.
I love you because you're a journalist and you're doing something that is really right for the country. When we saw your article, we said, we got to get this guy. If we could just take all the real pro-COVID vaccine people out of journalism, we'd probably get a bigger audience. I feel like we were really fighting against the media during this whole pandemic too. The stuff that they were putting out was scaring the shit out of everybody. Every day we remember when they had those killer hornets in Seattle, they were trying to scare everybody. Every day we could just find silly stuff, and I don't know where it was coming from. Some of it was the Washington Post, and
Susan, as you know, if I see the word grim or staggering again, I'm going to vomit.
Right. And I think now we need to, the only way we're going to get the word out to the general public, not just the people that watch us and, or people, a lot of people in this world are in this country are not able to watch YouTube all day. They're at work and they go home to their family and they feed their family, and, they don't even know who Dr. Drew is, and there needs to be let out to a bigger audience.
I blame the New York Times first and foremost, because they started all this nonsense on February 27th with that stupid podcast with Donald G. McNeil, and then they followed up the next day with their article, going medieval on the virus and so on. So the New York Times embarrassed. Also, the New York Times had a great, beautiful history in public health. For the previous 100 years, they did a respectable job during the parrots flu of 1929, where they said, stop slaughtering parrots. During the polio epidemics from 1940 to 1943, they were fantastic throughout that. They urged rationality and no closures, no public panic. They were great in 57, 58, 68, 69. They've been during SARS-CoV-1, even 2002, 2003, right. They were great. Right. I mean, this has been everything. They've been responsible on every issue, but on public health, they've been very responsible for 100 years. They threw it all away. For what and why? And they've stayed with it. Today, my friends, today, they have run an op-ed by an author who regrets the fact that China got rid of its zero COVID policies. That's what he says. He said, the CCP protected its people for 3 years, and now they've thrown it all away by opening it up. This is what the New York Times today says. What are we going to do about that?
Well, I will say I sent your article out to everybody I know, Jeffrey, because I thought it was I know I can encourage people to read that book, Deborah Birx's book, because it gives such great insight. But knowing that people won't, I figured if you're going to read something, read Jeffrey A. Tucker's review of it, because it was so well written. And I agree with Susan. I thank you for doing it and for being outspoken. You were on the front line since very, very early on in this debacle. And I know you took the slings and arrows. I know I did, and certainly have had, was kicked off social media, was off Twitter for more than a year. I just got back on. Have had multiple threats against my medical license, and continue to say that I would not do any of it any differently. I hope that you feel the same. I hope that you rest well at night knowing that you will end up squarely on the right side of history.
I'm happy. I was very much involved in the Great Barrington Declaration, from the very outset of that whole thing, and the release and the promotion of that thing, and that my whole life fell apart after that. It's true. But whatever. Why are we here?
Yeah.
We're here to tell the truth as best we see it, especially when nobody else is willing to do it. That's when you're called to speak out, when everybody else goes silent. So what's your life?
As Drew knows, I have quoted John Milton many, many times during this, that a virtue untested is no virtue at all. And you can live by that as well, because you certainly have been, you had a lot to lose. And it's when you have a lot to lose and you do it anyway, because it's the right thing to do. So I appreciate you, and thank you for being here with us for this. I know that
and please use us as an outlet. If you have something that's outraging you, please join us to talk about it. We'd love to.
I'm glad to come back anytime, but my friends, I know that sometimes people are exhausted with this topic and that sort of thing, and understandably so. And we're also exhausted of the things we're learning. The truth is grimmer than we even. To use your favorite word, grim.
My word, by the way, is my word is unprecedented. I said I've used the word unprecedented more in the past 3 years than I did in the preceding 50. So unprecedented.
I think in many ways, we have so much work to do. There's so much things that have to be undone, and so many things that have to be rebuilt. I named the institute Brownstone because my mother, once again, observed that in the early part of the 19th century, the way we built up this great country was through the use of this great rock called the Brownstone, which is malleable, and it was not expensive, and it's very durable, and it's what built all the great buildings throughout the 19th century before the age of steel, made it so much easier. And she said to me that day, she said, we have to rebuild. We have to rebuild this country. We have to rebuild public health. We have to rebuild everything after this disaster. So Brownstone's the right name, because that's how we built, and we're going to have to rebuild, and that's where we are today. So we can't.
What is your mother's name?
God bless her, Jan Tucker, Janice Tucker.
We need some sort of Janice Tucker call to action. You know what I mean? Some sort of Something.
Yes.
We'll see if we can get Janice Tucker as our figurehead. Let me I just want to point out a couple of things just since we've surveyed this scene. I feel like there's some stuff I just want to throw in if people say are watching this recording later. We've talked about the need to reduce EDC, redo public health. A couple of things on the public health side. It is almost exclusively populated by pediatricians, because much of the public health policy on the state level is around vaccine, and pediatricians, lo and behold, I have found during this pandemic, are not trained or equipped to handle adult medicine, particularly infectious disease. Their decision-making was off. Their judgment was wrong. The things they worried about, we wouldn't worry about in adult medicine. And it was really just the wrong training for adult disorders, number one. Number two, there are non-clinicians throughout the public health world, which must end. It must end. That is disgusting. They are not the people making decisions about clinical medicine. It must end. That must go. And then just a couple quick things. I had H1N1, and it was horrible. It was worse than a bad COVID, and I was 10 years younger, and it was horrible. We might remember that one killed 300,000 people. And the people of the United States did not even know it happened. So we went from one that was horrible that killed 300,000 to one that was horrible, equally horrible, killed a million plus. One we shut the world down for, the other you didn't even know happened. Maybe there is a middle ground in the world of public health that we can sort of strike. And then finally, as it pertains to the kids, I always point this story out because it's so vivid to me about how we forsaked children. They were so severely forsaken. When the Ukrainian moms were passing the border with their kids into Poland, there were microphones and cameras thrown in their faces. And I watched those interviews, and to a person, these women said, it's horrible. We had to leave our men, our sons, our husband we'd left behind to fight. It's awful. We have the guests, we have the kids with us. But more than anything else, these kids have been out of school for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. We have to get them back in school. It's been 2 weeks. And they put them into Polish-speaking schools because 2 weeks out of school was insanity. And yet we left them out for 2 years. So that will stay with me forever.
Dr. Drew, if you wouldn't mind, on your second point, do you mean by that we have too many, on your point about clinicians, do you mean to say that we have too many academics?
No. For instance, in the LA County, not physicians, have zero clinical experience. Sociologists, social workers, non-clinicians.
They're doctors like Jill Biden's a doctor. Okay. It's, you've got Dr. Barbara Ferrer in LA County, who is a social scientist. I mean, these are people who have, the ability to I don't even know what, but certainly not make decisions about public health guidance, and they're at the helm all over the country.
It's terrible. It's really, disgusting.
Really a problem.
Public health is to be a policymaker in public health, you think, requires some experience in dealing with patients and therapeutics
hope.
And yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a very interesting principle. And if you go back in time, you remember the people who inspired the lockdowns were not. They didn't have patients. They never seen a patient. They don't have clinics. There are people like Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College, with his throwing his models around and running his numbers and saying,
because the only way you're
running
ever
numbers
and
dealing with his
potential,
girlfriend down the street.
Yeah. Well, the only way you're going to ever understand the potential impact of something like it's a clinician who understands that children, when they get diagnosed with or referred for hearing or vision problems, it's because the teachers are the ones who refer those. Those rarely come from a parent. It's clinicians who understand what's going to happen when people miss their screening colonoscopy, their screening mammogram, their follow-up on their diabetes. It's clinicians who understand the impact of these sorts of things, of missing these appointments, of missing routine dental exams,
Kelly,
and what's going to happen.
It is us clinicians that what is hammered into our head is do no harm. And a sociologist has zero of such training and zero risk-reward decision-making, which is at the core of what we do.
No, I agree. And the idea of again, this therapeutic nihilism, these are things that social scientists and these administrators have no idea about. I'm not even giving Anthony Fauci a pass. The last time Anthony Fauci saw patients was 54 years ago. The CAT scan hadn't been invented yet. So I'm not sure he knows which end of the stethoscope to put in his ear.
But all your comments are premised on the idea that public health is about people, and
yes.
I'm not sure the people who are running public health today really get that. They think it's about systems and about models
I agree.
Yes.
and about
Yeah.
about control, as if we're all lab rats. Not even lab rats.
Right.
Yeah.
We're what do they call it in computer code? Like non-playing characters or something? I mean, they're not even real.
NPCs.
NPCs.
Well, they have
right. We're all
they
just
have become
NPCs.
the public health, and we've talked about this quite a bit. I can say because I did my postgraduate training at Harvard School of Public Health, and I can tell you they have become social justice warriors. It really has very little to do, as you said, about public health, and it's more about equity and systems and making sure things that really have nothing to do with public health. Because if you leave sort of the risk benefit calculation behind, which they did, if you act as if everyone is at equivalent risk, there is no equality when it comes to disease. Viruses don't need to be equitable. There's no requirement that a virus is equitable, regardless of whether or not you find that a nice public health construct. It doesn't happen. So they have become, as you said, much more interested in systems and in things that have nothing to do with really what's to benefit the public.
Please write about that. That's your next article.
My friends, I still can't quite shake off the horrifying reality that in the name of public health, we have ruined public health in this country.
Correct.
Utterly wrecked it.
Correct.
We are facing
Correct.
an unprecedented crisis. 3 years ago, I could walk through the streets of Manhattan and not be enveloped by just bellows of marijuana smoke everywhere. I'm
Right.
sorry to sound old-fashioned, but this is outrageous. And not to mention the opioid epidemic and the as everybody calls it, the COVID-19, the weight gain during the lockdowns was just
Right.
unbelievable, and just the loss of concern, the closure of the gyms, the non-emphasis on health and sunshine and exercise. I mean, and the shutdown of the medical system. Do you know? And my training is in economics and not in medicine or health or other forms of science. But if you look at the data about public health spending, how much people spent on their own medical care during the pandemic, it crashed down like 30%.
Correct.
What are we doing? So historians are going to look back at, a pandemic? Well, how come the hospitals were underused? How come healthcare spending plummeted during a pandemic? What was going on with these people?
You really couldn't have come up with a way to harm health more than you did. You told people stay indoors, close the gyms, do not gather with friends and family, don't go to church, okay? Don't get screening exams, don't go to school and further your education. Sit on the sofa,
close the window
watch
indoors,
Netflix, and stay indoors. I mean, you couldn't really have come up with a formula to be more harmful overall to to the functioning of their immune system
and
or
for
their
COVID
overall health and
specifically.
wellness. Exactly. That's what I mean. For COVID specifically, there's a reason why during the tuberculosis, outbreaks, they put people on the roofs of the hospital and they let them outdoors. They put them outside, not inside. We have a long history. People acted as if we've all of a sudden forgotten all of that. I preach to people all the time, healthy diet, regular exercise, stress mitigation, everything that we didn't let them do. Okay. Social isolation is probably one of the most devastating things you can do to the immune system.
Unbelievable.
Horrible.
Yeah.
And
Horrible.
not to mention psychological torment, right? I mean, I had one friend,
Yep.
his
Correct.
whole
Yep.
social circle, his entire social circle was connected with his AA group, right? The
Yeah.
lockdowns came,
Right.
Oh yeah.
he couldn't, and not only was it preventing him from returning to the batu, and among other terrible things that he used to do,
Mhm.
but it was his entire life. So suddenly the
Right.
lockdowns came.
Yeah.
He was isolated, and the only thing that was open in town were the liquor stores and the
The
pot
liquor stores.
shops. So guess
Right.
what? And so yeah, of course. So guess what?
God.
I asked, by the
Right.
way, a public health official in Massachusetts. I said, if this is a public health crisis, if you're dealing with public health, why are all the liquor stores open? And
Right.
they said to me, listen, if we shut the liquor stores, there'd be like a revolution in this country. Well, okay. Well, the liquor stores made more money than ever during that period,
Right.
during the lockdown period. And
Right.
and
Right.
if you can go look at the data yourself, I mean, the sales are through the roof. And
Right.
so it was a public health disaster. So the public health establishment created the biggest public health crisis of our
Yes.
lifetimes. We've reversed whatever progress
Right.
we're making since World War
Yep.
II has been completely reversed. The life expectancy is on the decline, 1, 2, and 3 years
Right.
as a result,
Right.
not because of people dying from COVID, from the fallout from the lockdowns,
Yes.
from the calamity they created. You know, I'm sorry you're getting me whipped up here, but again, there will not be justice. But at least we need some admission of wrongdoing, some humility, and the courage to say we are wrong, and let's go about fixing it through whatever ways we can, through old-fashioned traditional public health principles, all of which we need to recover.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for being here, Jeffrey. And as I said,
Amen.
you are welcome to join us whenever there's something that comes across your desk. We'd love to discuss it further. So we appreciate it very much.
All the best.
Our pleasure. Coming
Thanks,
up, Kelly, you want to talk about Dr. Richard Urso tomorrow?
Yes, we have Richard Urso, who's an ophthalmologist down in Texas and also the founder of the Global COVID Summit. He's been on the front lines with me, speaking out about this fiasco from the very beginning. And he'll be a great guest. He's got lots to talk about, including the vaccines and lipid nanoparticles and those sorts of things. And then I know I've got Dr. Ryan Cole back by popular demand for
Next
Dr.
week.
Ryan Cole
Yep.
Part 2. He's on the following Wednesday, the 1st. And then Senator Ron Johnson coming the next week. Really excited to have him. He's been just incredibly outspoken, a huge supporter of the work we've been doing from the very beginning of the pandemic. He's one of the few in Washington who's really gone to the mat for us. So we've got some great, and then we've got a couple of terrific
And then
researchers.
Dr. Rose.
Dr. Jessica Rose coming on the 15th of February. She's got great data to share. She's just a brilliant analyst and has a lot of data to share on everything from just the COVID pandemic in general, and then also obviously with regard to the vaccines.
Great.
And then we have Brooke Jackson, who is a whistleblower, was working with Batavia, which was the company tasked with overseeing Pfizer's COVID vaccine trials. And she is the person who actually saw these irregularities in the trials, went to the FDA to report them, and she was fired within a matter of hours. And she has a lot to say about what went on during the vaccine trials. Interesting
All right.
stuff.
So for the
coming
next
up.
month, we've got a lot lined up for you, but we'll see everyone tomorrow. We're going to be a little bit later tomorrow. Tomorrow's 4:00 Pacific instead of 3 o'clock.
4 o'clock Pacific. Yes.
So make note of that. What's that, Susan? What's going on?
Never mind.
You screamed out, "Oh," and then said no. All right. So 4:00 tomorrow. We do not have a show on Thursday and Friday. I accidentally said today's show was at 4:00, but it obviously was at 3:00. And if I misled any of you, please go watch the first with Jeffrey. It was amazing. And then it'll be back to usual schedule next week. So Kelly, as always, thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow at 4:00.
Sounds great. See you tomorrow. Thanks.
Ask Dr. Drew is produced by Caleb Nation and Susan Pinsky. As a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. This show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your personal doctor, and I am not practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help.
I didn't realize what their whole thing was.
Which part?
Juggalos. Just like their family, and because they're all white rapping, that they have to really like tread lightly on like any kind of race issue. So I was like, man, for a rap festival, there is 0 black people here.
Oh.
And then one black guy stood up in like the back of the audience and he was like, what about me? And I was like, one Jugga bro does not whatever make. And then they just started like, and then someone stood up and goes, hey man, it doesn't matter what color we are. We all bleed clown. And then I asked into the microphone if I could stop doing comedy then. I was like, can I stop? I don't even know how to reply to that. We all bleed clown.